Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Adventure and Mystery Book Club. I'm Bill Mallory, branch manager of the La Jolla Library. I'm so glad you could join me today for our reading of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Today we are reading chapters 17 and 18. Our story up till now, of course, our three main characters, if you will. Really, it's Professor of Marine Biology Pierre Aronnax is the main character. He's got his manservant Conseil and a Canadian harpooner by the name of Ned Land, and they are now aboard Captain Nemo's ship, the Nautilus, the amazing submarine that can outrun any vessel made by man that is not the Nautilus. And right now, the captain has he's shown them the wonders of the ship. He has shown them all of um, the shells and relics of the sea that are rare, valuable, amazing shells and pearls and other things that if he were to take them to land, of course, he would be very rich. But of course, he says he's already very rich, so it doesn't really matter to him. And so Captain Nemo is invited them all to uh, go on a hunting expedition in the forests of Crespo Island. And they all sound very interested. Oh, a bit of sport. That sounds like fun. They're all kind of really getting into this until they find out that the forests are actually underwater forests. And they have had to put on these very elaborate diving gear. They didn't really have wetsuits back then, but they had these diving gear with a large helmet, large copper helmet for to protect them, and have oxygen pumped in, of course. And this is how they are going out to the forest, and that's where our chapter 17 begins. So, with my book in hand, if you're ready, we will start. Chapter 17, appropriately entitled An Underwater Forest. We had finally arrived at the edge of this forest, undoubtedly one of the most beautiful in all of Captain Nemo's vast domain. He considered it his own, and claimed the same rights over it as had the first men at the beginning of time. Moreover, who was going to dispute his ownership of this underwater property? What braver pioneer was going to come with an axe and clear away these dark groves? The forest was composed of large tree-like plants, and as soon as we had gone under its vast arches, I was struck by the strange shape of their branches, a shape I had never seen before. None of the grass covering the ground, nor any of the branches attached to the trees, was inclined, bent, or in any way horizontal. Everything rose toward the surface. There were no filaments or ribbons, no matter how thin, which weren't standing as straight as ramrods. Due to the density of the element which had produced them, the sea wrack and creepers grew in a rigid vertical line. They were normally motionless, but when I pushed them aside with my hand, they immediately went back to their original position. This was the reign of the vertical. I soon became accustomed to this peculiar arrangement of things, as well as to the relative darkness which surrounded us. The forest floor was strewn with sharp rocks, which were difficult to avoid. The plant life here seemed quite complete, richer than it would have been in the Arctic or tropical zones where such products are less numerous. But for several minutes I involuntarily confused the two kingdoms, making zoophytes and hydrophytes, animals for plants. But who would not have made the same mistake? Fauna and flora are so closely related to one another in this underwater world. I noticed that all the specimens of the vegetable kingdom were only lightly held to the ground. Without roots, and not caring whether they are fixed to something solid, sand, shells, or pebbles, They only ask of the ground for something to hang on to, not for their life's blood. These plants are self-propagating and derive their existence from the water which sustains and nourishes them. Most of them had, instead of leaves, whimsically shaped blades in a narrow range of colors, comprising only pink, carmine, green, olive, tan, and brown. I now saw, but no longer no longer dried out like the specimens in the Nautilus, some padinae spread out fan-shaped like a peacock's tail as if to catch the breeze. Scarlet-colored Ceramiaceae, laminaria, stretching out their edible shoots, slender, wavy nereocysts, growing to a height of 50 feet. Bunches of acetabulae, whose stems grew thicker at the top, and many other deep-sea plants, all without flowers. What a strange and peculiar world, as one clever naturalist put it, where the animal kingdom flowers and the vegetable kingdom doesn't. Among these various shrubs, as big as trees of temperate zones, and beneath their damp shadows were massed together real bushes of living flowers, hedges of zoophytes, on which blossomed striped meandrinae, with their twisting furrows, yellowish carophylliae, with transparent tentacles and tufts of zootharia, and, to complete the illusion, fish flies flew from branch to branch like a flock of hummingbirds, while yellow lapis-acanthae, with bristling jaws and pointed scales, dactylopteridae, monocentridae, rose at our feet like a flock of snipe. Toward 1 in the afternoon, Captain Nemo gave the signal to halt. I was rather pleased to stop, and we stretched out under a bower of alariae, with their long ribbons shooting out as straight as arrows. This short rest delighted me. Nothing was lacking but the charm of conversation, but it was impossible to talk. I brought my large copper helmet near Conseil's. I saw his eyes shining with joy, and to show his satisfaction, he bobbed his head around inside the helmet in a most comical way imaginable. I was very surprised not to feel very hungry after walking for 4 hours. I had no idea what caused my stomach to react this way, but on the other hand, as happens with all divers, I felt an uncontrollable desire to sleep. Soon my eyes closed beneath their thick glass windows, and I fell into a deep slumber, which, till then, I had been able to fight off merely by walking. I was thus merely following the example of Captain Nemo and his powerful companion, who had already stretched out and gone to sleep. There was no way of knowing how long I dozed, but when I awoke it seemed as if the sun were sinking toward the horizon. Captain Nemo had already gotten up, and I was beginning to stretch my limbs when an unexpected sight brought me quickly to my feet. Only a few steps away, a monstrous spider crab, 3 feet high, was eyeing me, ready to jump. Although my diving suit was thick enough to protect me from his bite, I could not help shuddering with horror. Just then, Conseil and the sailor from the Nautilus awoke. Captain Nemo pointed out the hideous crab to his companion, who knocked it down with one blow of his rifle butt, and I watched the monster's claws writhe in horrible convulsions. This encounter made me think that even more fearful animals must inhabit these dark depths, animals against which my suit would not be thick enough to protect me. Until now this had not occurred to me, and I resolved to be on my guard. Moreover, I supposed that this halt had marked the end of our walk. But I was wrong, and instead of returning to the Nautilus, Captain Nemo continued his daring excursion. The ground continued falling off, but at an even greater angle, taking us deeper and deeper. It must have been around 3 o'clock when we reached a depth of about 500 feet in a narrow valley between high vertical walls. Thanks to the perfection of our diving equipment, we were thus going 300 feet deeper than men had ever gone before. I say 500 feet, even though no instrument permitted me to calculate this depth. But I knew that even in the clearest water, the sun's rays penetrate no deeper. And just then the darkness had become almost complete. 10 steps away I could see nothing. I was therefore walking, groping my way along, when I suddenly saw a bright white light shining ahead. Captain Nemo had just turned on his electric lamp. His companion did the same. Conseil and I followed their example. By turning a screw, I connected the coil to the glass spiral, and the sea, lit by our 4 lanterns, was illuminated within a radius of 80 feet. Captain Nemo continued on into the obscure depths of the forest, whose shrubs were getting scarcer and scarcer. I noticed the vegetable life disappeared quicker than animal life. The deep-sea plants were already abandoning the soil, which was becoming increasingly arid, but it was still swarming with animals, zoophytes, articulata, mollusks, and fish. As we walked, I thought that the light from our Ruhmkorff lamps would necessarily attract some inhabitants of these dark depths. But if they did approach, it was never near enough for us to shoot them. Several times I saw Captain Nemo stop, put his gun to his shoulder, and then, after a moment, bring it down again and continue on his way. Finally, at about 4 o'clock, this marvelous excursion came to an end. A huge, magnificent wall of rock rose before us, a heap of gigantic blocks, an enormous, unclimbable granite cliff hollowed out with dark caves. This was the edge of Crespo Island. This was land. Captain Nemo stopped suddenly. He motioned for us to halt, and as much as I would have liked to try and climb this wall, I too had to stop. Here ended Captain Nemo's domains. He did not want to go further. Beyond lay that part of the globe on which he was never again to set foot. We began the return trip. Captain Nemo had again taken the lead and continued walking forward without hesitation. It seemed to me that we were not returning to the Nautilus by the same path. This new route, very steep and difficult, brought us quickly up toward the surface. Nevertheless, this return to the upper layers of the ocean was not so sudden as to bring about too quick a decompression, which would have done us serious injury and produced those internal lesions so fatal to divers. Very soon the light reappeared and grew stronger, and since the sun was already low on the horizon, the refraction again edged every object with a rainbow-like border. At a depth of 30 feet, we walked amid a swarm of little fish of all kinds, more numerous than birds in the air and also more agile. But no underwater game worthy of a shot had yet met our gaze. Just then, I saw the captain quickly shoulder his gun, and, following something moving among the shrubbery, he fired. I heard a faint hissing sound, and an animal fell dead several feet away. It was a magnificent sea otter, an anhydrus, the only quadruped that lives entirely in the ocean. This one was 5 feet long and must have been very valuable. Its fur, chestnut brown on top and silver underneath, was of the kind so sought after on the Russian and Chinese market. Its quality and luster would have made it worth at least $400. I looked admiringly at this strange animal with its round head and short ears, its large eyes and cat-like whiskers, its clawed, webbed feet, and tufted tail. This precious carnivore, hunted and tracked by fishermen, is becoming extremely rare, and it has taken refuge mainly in the North Pacific, from which it will probably soon disappear completely. Captain Nemo's companion came over to take the animal. He put it on his shoulder, and once again we started on our way. For an hour, a sandy plain stretched out before us. Often it rose to within 6 feet of the surface. I could then see our image clearly reflected on the surface, but in reverse. Above us, there was an identical band of men, exactly reproducing our movements and gestures, with the only difference that it was walking upside down with its feet in the air. I also noticed another strange effect. Thick clouds passed by, forming and disappearing rapidly. But when I thought it over, I realized that these so-called clouds were merely due to the varying height of the water in the midst of a groundswell. And when I looked carefully, I could see the foam breaking on its crests and spreading over the surface. I could even see the shadows of large birds overhead as they came down and skimmed the water. It was then that I witnessed one of the finest shots that had ever thrilled a hunter. We could clearly make out a large bird with broad wings spread soaring in our direction. Captain Nemo's companion raised his gun and fired when it was only several feet above the surface. The animal fell dead, and the force of its fall brought it within the hunter's grasp. It was a magnificent albatross, a splendid specimen of those ocean-going birds. But this incident did not interrupt our march. For 2 hours we crossed sandy plains, alternating with prairies of seaweed in which it was very difficult to walk. I was at the end of my strength when we finally saw a vague glimmer piercing the darkness of the water a half a mile away. It was the Nautilus's light. We would be on board within 20 minutes, and once there, I could again breathe comfortably, for I felt that the air now furnished by my tank was very low in oxygen, but I had not reckoned with an encounter which somewhat delayed our arrival. I was some 20 paces behind when I saw Captain Nemo turn and run toward me. With his powerful arms he pushed me down, while his companion did the same to Conseil. At first I did not know what to make of this sudden attack, but I was reassured by seeing the captain lie down next to me and remain immobile. I was therefore stretched out on the ground, sheltered by a shrub of seaweed, when I raised my head and saw some huge shapes swirl past, leaving streams of phosphorescence behind them. The blood froze in my veins. I saw we were being threatened by 2 formidable dogfish, those terrible sharks with enormous tails and dull, glassy eyes, who secrete a phosphorescent substance through holes around their snouts. They are like monstrous fireflies who can crush an entire man in their jaws of iron. I don't know if Conseil was busy classifying them, but for me, I was observing their silver bellies and huge mouths bristling with teeth from a not altogether scientific point of view, rather as a prospective victim than a naturalist. Very fortunately, these voracious animals have bad eyesight. They passed by without seeing us, letting their brownish tails brush against us, and as if by a miracle, we escaped a danger surely greater than that of meeting a tiger in the jungle. A half an hour later, guided by the electric light, we reached the Nautilus. The outside door had been left open, and once we were inside the first compartment, Captain Nemo closed this door behind us. He then pressed a button. I could hear pumps working inside the submarine. I felt the water level lowering around me, and in a few moments the compartment was entirely empty. The inside door was opened and we stepped into the dressing room. There, our diving suits were taken off, although not without some difficulty, and I, exhausted and dying of hunger, went to my room in a state of wonder at our extraordinary excursion in the ocean depths. And now, Chapter 18, entitled 4,000 Leagues Under the Pacific. The next morning, November 18th, I had completely recovered from my exhaustion of the day before, and I went up onto the platform just as the first mate was uttering his usual daily phrase. It then struck me that it referred to the condition of the ocean, or rather, it meant nothing in sight. And as a matter of fact, the ocean was deserted. There was not a sail on the horizon. The hills of Crespo Island had disappeared during the night. The ocean absorbed all the colors of the spectrum, except blue, which it threw off in all directions and turned the water a magnificent indigo color. The sea looked like silk printed with large wavy patterns. I was admiring this splendid sight when Captain Nemo appeared. He did not seem to notice my presence and began a series of astronomic observations. When he was through, he went over and leaned on the searchlight housing and gazed abstractedly at the surface of the ocean. In the meanwhile, 20 or so sailors from the Nautilus, all strong and well built, had come up on the platform. They had come to take in the nets that had been trailing behind the ship all night. These sailors obviously came from different countries, even though they were all European in type. I could clearly see that there were Irishmen, Frenchmen, a few Slavs, and a Greek or Cretan. But these men spoke little, and when they did, it was in that strange language whose origin I could not even guess. I therefore had to give up any hope of questioning them. The nets were hauled in. They were a kind of drag net, similar to those used on the coast of Normandy. There were like huge pockets held open by a floating rod and a chain interwoven in the lower meshes. Thus arranged, they would drag along the ocean floor and gather everything in their path. That day, they had brought up many curious specimens from these waters so rich in sea life. There were anglerfish, whose peculiar movements made them look like comedians on stage, black commersons with their antennae, triggerfish with red stripes running around their bodies, globefish with their poisoned flesh, several olive-colored lampreys, macrorhynchi with their silvery scales, cutlass fish who can give as strong a shock as an electric eel or an electric ray, scaly notopteri with brown cross stripes, a greenish variety of cod, several kinds of gobies, etc. Finally, there were several larger kinds of fish, a caranx with a prominent head and a body about 3 feet long, several lovely bonitos, decked in blue and silver, and 3 magnificent tuna, whose great speed had not been enough to save them from the dragnets. I reckoned that this haul had brought in more than 1,000 pounds of fish. It was a good catch, but not exceptional, since these nets were always left trailing for several hours. They always picked up a whole world of underwater creatures. We would, therefore, not be short of excellent provisions, which the Nautilus's speed and the attraction of its electric light could renew endlessly. These various products of the sea were immediately lowered through the hatch and brought into the storeroom, some to be eaten fresh, and others to be preserved. Now that the fishing was ended and the air supply renewed, I thought that the Nautilus would once again be off on its underwater journey. I was therefore about to go back to my room when Captain Nemo, without any sort of preamble, turned toward me and said, "Look at the ocean, Professor. Can you say it isn't alive? Doesn't it also have its moments of anger and tenderness? Yesterday it went to sleep just as we did, and now it's awakening after a peaceful night. The captain hadn't even bothered to say good morning. It was as if this strange man were continuing some conversation he had begun earlier. Look, he said, it's awakening beneath the sun's caresses. Once again, it's going to relive its daily life. How fascinating it is to study its functions. It has a pulse, arteries, and occasional spasms, and I agree with the scientist Maury, who discovered that it has a circulation as real as that of blood in animals. I felt sure that Captain Nemo expected no answer on my part, and it seemed senseless for me to utter phrases such as, of course, certainly, and you're quite right. He was talking more to himself, with long pauses between each sentence. He was thinking out loud. Yes, he said, the ocean indeed has circulation, and to set it in motion, the creator of all things has only to alter its temperature or content of salts or of microscopic animals. Changes in temperature bring about varying densities which cause currents and countercurrents. Evaporation, which is non-existent in polar regions and very active in equatorial zones, make for a permanent exchange of polar and tropical waters. Moreover, I've come across some vertical currents which make it really seem as if the ocean is breathing. I have observed how the molecules of water are heated on the surface, go down to the ocean depths, attain their maximum density at 36 degrees Fahrenheit, and then lose their heat, thereby becoming lighter and once again rise to the surface. At the pole, you'll see the consequences of this phenomenon, and you'll understand why, by this law of all foreseeing nature, ice can only form on the surface of the water. While Captain Nemo was finishing this sentence, I said to myself, that pole, does this madman intend to take us there too? In the meanwhile, the captain had stopped talking. For a while he merely gazed at the sea, which he had so thoroughly and incessantly studied. Then he started in again. Salts, he said, exist in large quantities in the ocean, and if you removed all those it contained, you would have a mass of 121,500,000,000 cubic miles, which, if it were spread out over the earth, would form a layer of about 35 feet thick. And don't think that the presence of these salts is merely due to some whim of nature. No, they make the waters of the sea less susceptible to evaporation, and prevent the winds from taking off too much of this water vapor, which, upon turning back into water, would submerge the temperate zones of the earth. These salts play an immense stabilizing role in the general functioning of the globe. Captain Nemo stopped, straightened up, and took several steps on the platform, and then, coming back to me, he said, and for those countless microscopic organisms, millions of which exist in one small drop of water, and 800,000 of which one would need to make up 1 milligram in weight, their role is just as important. They take in marine salts, absorb the solid elements in water by their formation of corals and madrepores. They are the true creators of calcareous continents. And then the drop of water, deprived of its mineral content, becomes lighter and rises to the surface, where it absorbs those salts left behind by evaporation, becomes heavier, and goes back down, bringing new elements to be consumed by these organisms. Thus you have a double current, rising and falling, incessant movement and life. And this life is more intense, luxuriant, and vast than that on land. It spreads out over all parts of that ocean which people have said is a place of death for men and of life for millions of animals, and for me. When Captain Nemo talked like this, he became transformed, and I found myself very moved. There you have real life, he added, and I can imagine founding cities in the sea, agglomerations of underwater houses which, like the Nautilus, would come to the surface each morning to breathe, cities that would be free and independent. But even then, who knows but some despot might come along. Captain Nemo finished the sentence with a violent gesture. Then, addressing me directly, and as if to dispel a morbid thought, he asked, Monsieur Aronnax, do you know how deep the ocean is? All I know, Captain, is what I've learned from the principal soundings people have made. Could you cite them so I can check them as we go along? I'll give you those I remember. If I'm not mistaken, the North Atlantic has been found to have an average depth of 27,000 feet, and the Mediterranean 8,000 feet. The most remarkable soundings been taken in the South Atlantic near the 35th parallel, and they've shown depths of up to 40,000, 46,230, and 49,700 feet. In short, it has been estimated that the average depth of the ocean is about 4 miles. Well, Professor, replied Captain Nemo, I hope to be able to give you more accurate figures. As for the average depth in this part of the Pacific, let me tell you that it is only 13,000 feet. Having said this, Captain Nemo went over to the hatch and climbed down the companionway. I followed him and went into the lounge. I could feel the propeller start up, and soon the log showed us to be traveling at 20 knots. During the days and weeks that followed, I saw Captain Nemo rarely. His first mate regularly marked the ship's position on the chart, and I was thus able to follow its course with great accuracy. Conseil and Ned Land spent many hours with me. Conseil had told his friend about the marvels of our underwater excursion, and the Canadian regretted not having accompanied us. But I hoped he would have another chance to visit these ocean forests. Almost every day, the panels of the lounge remained open for several hours, and we would never get tired of watching the mysteries of underwater life. The Nautilus's general course was to the southeast as it cruised at depths between 300 and 500 feet. One day, however, and I never knew why, it dove at a steep angle by means of its side fins and reached a depth of 6,500 feet. The thermometer read 39.65 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature which at that depth was apparently constant in all latitudes. On November 26th at 3 in the morning, the Nautilus crossed the Tropic of Cancer at 172 degrees west longitude. On the 27th, it passed within sight of the Hawaiian Islands, where the famous Captain Cook had met his death on February 14, 1779. We had by then traveled 4,860 leagues from our point of departure. When I came up on the platform that morning, I could see, about 2 miles off to leeward, Hawaii, the largest of the 7 islands that form this archipelago. I could clearly make out the cultivated fields around its edge, the various mountain chains running parallel to the coast, and the volcanoes dominated by Mauna Kea, which rises 13,800 feet above sea level. Among other specimens from these waters, the nets brought up some peacock-like flabellaria, a flat, amusingly shaped polyp peculiar to this area. The Nautilus continued on its southeasterly course. On the 1st of December, it crossed the equator at 142 degrees west longitude, and on the 4th of the same month, after a rapid and uneventful crossing, we sighted the Marquesas, 3 miles off at 8 degrees 57 minutes south latitude and 139 degrees 32 minutes west longitude. I saw Martin Point on Nukuhiva, the main island of this group belonging to France. I could only make out the wooded mountains outlined against the horizon, for Captain Nemo did not like to get too near land. Here the nets brought up some lovely specimens of fish. There were coryphinae with their azure fins and golden tails, whose flesh is unequaled in all the world. Hologymnosiae, with almost no scales, but which taste superb. Ostrohinsae, with their bony jaws, yellowish thasards, as good to eat as bonito, all worthy of being classified in the ship's kitchen. After leaving these charming islands protected by the French flag, the Nautilus traveled about 2,000 miles between the 4th and the 11th of December. This journey was noteworthy for our encounter with an immense school of squid, a curious mollusk closely related to the cuttlefish. French fishermen call them incornets. They belong to the class of Cephalopoda and the family of Dibranchiata, which also comprises the cuttlefish and the argonaut. These animals were especially carefully studied by naturalists of classical times, and they not only furnished numerous metaphors to Greek orators, but also an excellent dish for the dinner tables of the rich, and we can believe Ateneus, a Greek doctor who lived there before Galen. It was during the night of December 9th to 10th that the Nautilus encountered this army of mollusks, which are particularly nocturnal. We could count them by the millions. They were migrating from temperate to warmer regions, following in the wake of herrings and sardines. Through the thick glass panels, we could watch them swimming backward very fast, impelling themselves by means of their locomotor tube, chasing fish and other mollusks, eating the little ones and being eaten by the larger ones, and in indescribable confusion, tossing around the 10 arms nature had attached to their heads like a crest of pneumatic serpents. In spite of its speed, the Nautilus cruised for several hours in the midst of this swarm of animals, and its nets brought in great numbers of them, among which I could recognize all 9 species that D'Orbigny had classified as living in the Pacific. As the reader can easily see, during this trip the sea showed us its most marvelous spectacles, and with continual variation. The scenery seemed to change for our own pleasure, and we were called upon not only to witness the works of the Creator in the midst of the waters, but also to penetrate the most fearful mysteries of the ocean. On December 11th, I was reading in the big lounge. Ned Land and Conseil were watching the luminous waters through the half-opened panels. The Nautilus lay motionless with its reservoirs filled, at a depth of over 3,000 feet, a relatively uninhabited region of the ocean in which only larger fish make an occasional appearance. I was reading a delightful book by Jean Massey called Servants of the Stomach, and savoring its ingenious lessons, when Conseil interrupted me. "Would the monsieur please come here a moment?" he said, in a strange tone of voice. "What is it, Conseil?" "I would like monsieur to see for himself." I got up, went over to the window, and looked out. Beneath the electric light, an enormous, blackish, immobile mass was suspended in the water. I watched it attentively, trying to see if it was some kind of gigantic whale. But a thought suddenly crossed my mind. "A ship!" I cried. "Yeah," answered the Canadian. "A disabled vessel that sunk." Ned Land was right. It was a ship, with its severed shrouds still hanging from the chain plates. Its hull seemed to be in good condition, but it had apparently sunk no more than several hours before. 3 stumps of masts, cut off several feet above the deck, showed that this ship, when already taking in water, had tried sacrificing its masts. But it must have been lying on its side and filled with water, for it was still heeling over to port. It was a sad sight, this carcass, lost beneath the waves. But its deck was an even sadder sight, for there were still several cadavers bound in ropes. I could count 4 men, one of whom was still standing at the helm, and then a woman, half out of the hatch on the poop deck and holding a child in her arms. By the brilliant light of the Nautilus, I could make out her features, which had not yet been decomposed by the water. In a supreme effort, she raised the child over her head, and this poor little creature's arms were still entwined around its mother's neck. The positions of the 4 sailors were frightening. They were twisted in convulsive movements, making a last effort to tear off the ropes binding them to the ship. Only the helmsman, with his face clear and serious, his graying hair stuck to his forehead, his hand clutching the wheel, seemed to be steering his sunken 3-master through the ocean depths. What a scene! We were all left speechless, our hearts beating fast, before the idea of actually witnessing a sinking and, in a sense, being able to photograph its final moments. And already I could see enormous sharks, with fire in their eyes, moving in on the wreck, attracted by the human flesh. In the meanwhile, the Nautilus circled around the sunken ship, and for an instant I could make out its stern. Florida, Sunderland. And we'll end it there. On that very dramatic note, that is our conclusion of chapter 18. We'll take a pause then, and we will return on Monday at 4 p.m. as we read chapters 19 and 20, and we will see more about the vessel. And hope you all have a very good weekend. We are going to be back soon, and take care of yourselves. Thank you for joining me today, and we will see you again next week. Bye, everyone.